The air was thick with dust and silence as the sun leaned toward the ridgeline, casting long shadows across the makeshift sniper range, and the general stood still as a statue hands behind his back, boots planted like roots, watching the distant. Metal plates shimmer in the afternoon heat, the heat that distorted even certainty into mirage. He had seen failure 13 times, and each one had chipped away at the patience of a man who had survived wars and betrayals and headlines that forgot. The cost of each mistake now. He needed one shot, just one that would land where none had before, and he did not care who made it, as long as it was made. Around him, the unit stood tense, breathing in sync but uneven eyes flicking to the woman who had stepped forward, last barely noticed until now, a presence quiet and unremarkable, except to those who remembered her name from an old dossier buried in a forgotten folder, tagged with words like instinct and outlier and control risk. Her name was Ava, and she was not the best in the unit, not according to tests or ranks or traditions that measured value in kills and medals, but she was the one who had come back from an op that erased 3 others and never spoke of what she saw, only of what she aimed for. They said she could read wind like a whisper, that her finger moved before orders, and that she saw in trajectories what others saw in dreams and fear. But none of that mattered to the general. What mattered was the plate downrange, the cold steel rectangle 4,000 meters away, painted in orange and insulted by every shot that missed it. Ava stepped to her crate where the rifle waited, not new but rebuilt old parts stripped and re-engineered until the weapon barely held together. A contradiction of power and fragility. And she felt the weight of it in her hands, the same way a surgeon might feel the blade before the cut. Certain not of outcome, but of necessity. The men around her muttered in half-tones, their breath laced with tension and doubt and things unspoken. Some of them believed in luck, others in math, and a few in silence, but none of them believed this would be the shot that mattered. Not after 13 misses, not after wind shifts and miscalculations, and the unspoken truth that the rifle itself might betray the one who pulled the trigger. She sat up slowly, placing the rifle down, aligning it with the bipod, adjusting the cheek rest like she was tucking a child into sleep. Her movements were muscle memory, and meditation wrapped in repetition. Her breathing was slow and deliberate, drawn from a well of control that had been built through hours of waiting in wet mud and dry heat, and the cold stare of targets that never blinked. Behind her, the range. Officer began the cadence, his voice flat through the comms, counting down the window of fire, and Ava listened but did not truly hear. Instead, she felt the rise of the valley wind as it pushed eastward, slower than expected, heavier with heat and the promise of stillness, and she knew that meant the shot would carry but not fly. It would drift, but not falter. The general moved behind the glass, his face unreadable, his thoughts buried beneath layers of protocol and stakes and the weight of people watching through digital eyes from somewhere far where no dust touched their boots and no heartbeat echoed through their ribs like it did in this valley, this unforgiving stretch of land that turned men into history and women into statistics. Ava adjusted the scope, turned the dial by a measure so fine it could not be seen, only felt. And in that motion, she committed to the shot, knowing there would be no second attempt. Not for her, not today. She exhaled and let her mind go blank, the way she had been taught but never mastered until the moment it mattered, and now it did matter, because the general had asked, and she had said yes not out of ambition, but because there was something she needed to prove, not to them, but to herself, and to the face in the photo she had folded in her pocket. The target stood unmoving, indifferent to legacy or failure, just a shape waiting to echo with impact or remain untouched by another wasted attempt, and Ava knew that hitting it would not change the world. But it would change something within it, a ripple in the fabric of what was possible and what was still to come. The shot was not yet taken, But in her mind it had already begun. She saw the path through the haze, the arc through the wind, the fall of the bullet shaped by gravity and prayer, and all the tiny choices that had brought her to this point, each heartbeat before this one, a metronome that kept time with fate. She touched the trigger gently the way you might touch a bruise, not to hurt it, but to know it is still there. And then her breath stopped, and her muscles went still, and for a moment everything held its breath with her. The sky, the wind, the watchers, the plate itself. The rifle barked, and the recoil whispered back into her shoulder, and the round left the barrel carving a line through the world that no one could follow, but all could wait for. The drone would track it, and the sensors would try to catch it, and the eyes behind scopes would chase it, but none of them could see what she saw, because she had not aimed at the plate. She had aimed at the moment between failure and faith, and pulled the trigger on the hope that all the math and madness would land where none had before. And as the round flew, silent and swift, across 4 kilometers of air shaped by physics and belief, she did not blink and she did not breathe. She only waited for the valley to speak. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky with a rusted hue, and the valley began to shift, its breath cooler, now slower, as if watching the moment stretch beyond what it was meant to hold. The woman sat alone near the ammo crate, her fingers running lightly across the metal casing of the rifle, as if memorizing the scars left behind from recoil and time. Around her, the techs gathered like moths around code and diagnostics, muttering about telemetry and drift angles and irregularities in air density. Someone pointed to a screen where the bullet trace blinked, uncertainly caught halfway. Between confirmation and disbelief, and the general leaned over the shoulder of the data analyst and asked again if the hit was real or imagined. No one could answer, not yet, not without the drone returning. Not without the plate being seen, not with numbers alone. The drone operator squinted at the live feed, which shimmered from heat distortion and static. But something about the impact site looked wrong, or maybe right. Too right, and the silence in the command tent thickened into something sharp outside. Ava cleaned the barrel carefully. Slow strokes like a ritual she had done after every op, never for others, only for herself, because the rifle was not just a tool. It was the only thing that ever listened without question or consequence, and it deserved respect for what it had done, even if no one else could see it. Yet, a junior spotter walked over and asked if she wanted water. She shook her head once, not because she was ungrateful, but because her mouth was dry. Not from thirst, but from anticipation, and she could feel it in her bones that the shot had changed something, though she did not yet know what, or how, or for whom. Inside the tent, someone cursed softly, then louder, pointing at the high-res capture from the drone, which had finally circled back and stabilized the image. A perfectly centered strike dead in the middle of the plate, not a scratch, not a graze, not a lucky edge hit, but a clean hole, like a signature scrawled across steel. The general said nothing, just stared at the image as if it had betrayed him or fulfilled a prophecy he had forgotten he made, and the analysts scrambled to overlay data frames and confirm that yes, the shot had traveled 4,000 meters, and yes, the wind readings were correct, and yes, the shooter had adjusted less than the algorithm recommended. And yes, somehow she had known what the machine did not. They called it impossible, but the evidence was unflinching and the feed was undeniable, and soon voices that had been doubtful became loud and eager and speculative, already turning the moment into a headline and a doctrine and maybe a weapon to be used in arguments far from the valley. But Ava still sat by herself, her expression unchanged, her eyes closed as she listened to the echoes still unfolding around her like ripples from a stone thrown into deep water far too deep to know where it landed, only that it had been cast with purpose. The general walked toward her slowly, not with ceremony but with intent, and the others watched unsure whether this was commendation or interrogation or both. He stood over her and said nothing for a moment, then finally asked one question, not how or why or even did you, but instead he said, "Would you do it again?" She opened her eyes and met his gaze without hesitation, then nodded once, and in that nod was not just agreement but understanding of what it meant to hit a target no one else could and what it would now cost to have done so. He handed her a new data slate and told her to prepare for tomorrow, another test, another shot, another number to break, and this time observers would come not just soldiers, but scientists and suits and skeptics and maybe worse believers. She took the slate, but said nothing, and he turned and walked away, already speaking into his calm, already rewriting the next phase of this operation that had not even existed until her shot made it real, and the woman sat there again alone, except for the rifle and the dust and the knowledge that everything after this would not be about precision, but expectation. Night settled with a hush, and the wind shifted again, as if it too knew something was about to begin that no one had trained for, or written in manuals. And Ava stared at the sky and remembered something her father once said, that every shot was a question, and the bullet was just the answer. You never got to take back. She reached into her pocket and unfolded the photograph, smoothing the worn crease across the child's face, the little hand raised as if waving or shielding from sun, and on the back in crooked writing were 4 words that meant nothing to the analysts, but everything to her. Come home this time. And as the camp dimmed and the range fell quiet and the data continued to process under the glow of humming screens, the woman finally stood, stretched her shoulders, and walked to the range alone again. Her shadow long across the gravel, and she lay down, in the prone position not to shoot, but to feel the earth again beneath her stomach, grounding her, reminding her that all things, however precise, are still subject to gravity. She looked through the scope one more time at the plate that now bore her mark and wondered what the next one would demand, because every shot after the impossible would no longer be just a test. It would be a reckoning. The air was colder in the morning, a strange shift that came without warning, as if the valley itself had taken note of what happened the day before and was now holding its breath like the rest of them. Ava walked slowly toward the range, not yet in uniform, not yet acknowledged by the officers gathering near the main tent. She moved like a ghost, but everyone saw her now. They all knew her name. They all knew what she had done, and yet none dared speak it too loudly, as if saying it would unmake the moment, would somehow bring back the rules they had just watched her break. The plate was still, standing 4,000 meters away, untouched except for the hole she had carved into it, the perfect center shot that no one believed could be made, and now the brass were arriving one by one in unmarked vehicles with tinted windows stepping out. With tablets and smiles that didn't reach their eyes, they were not here for the mission. They were here for the myth, and they wanted to see if lightning would strike twice, or if Ava was just a trick of numbers, a statistical ghost wearing the skin of a soldier inside the planning tent. The general stood with arms crossed, watching the live feed as Ava stepped into frame near the weapon bench. Technicians followed her with careful distance, some trying to act casual, others openly watching. Her every move, each adjustment she made to the rifle was catalogued by a dozen cameras mounted overhead. Her breathing, her posture, even her silence had now become data. The general was tired. He had spent the night reading files, not just hers, but everyone's trying to understand what made her different, and why the systems that predicted excellence had never flagged her as anything more than average. And what he found unsettled him, because the deeper he looked, the more it seemed that she had never been meant to be here, never meant to hold that rifle, never meant to take that shot. She had slipped through every crack and only risen when others fell, and now here she was, changing the shape of what was possible with nothing more than breath and patience and trigger control. The shot from the day before had been verified a dozen different ways. The telemetry, the wind readings, the drone footage, the impact sensors, even the microfractures in the steel plate had all been analyzed and reanalyzed, and every line pointed to one conclusion: she had done it. The round had hit at 4,000 meters with no luck involved, just calculation and instinct and something no algorithm could name. But that was yesterday, and today was different. Today she was expected to do it again, and expectations were far heavier than hope they pressed on the chest. They narrowed the focus they made. The hands trembled even when the mind was still, and the general wondered if they were about to watch a miracle unravel into failure, or if they were standing at the beginning of something that none of them could stop. Ava lay prone at the edge of the range, her cheek resting on the stock, her eye behind the scope. But she was not ready to shoot, yet not until she felt the pattern of the wind and the weight of the distance. She did not trust the instruments alone. They lied too often or told truths out of context, and she needed more than that. She needed to listen to the world the way she had learned to in the desert on nights when only silence kept her company and every shadow might have been a man. The plate had been changed fresh steel, a new face but identical to the last, and behind it a bank of sensors to measure deflection and resonance and every possible metric the scientists could think of to translate a bullet into proof, because proof was what they wanted. Not just a hit, but a repeatable, measurable, undeniable truth that they could sell or weaponize or hang on a wall. The countdown began again, the voice flat and mechanical over the comms, and Ava's breathing slowed. She pictured the child's drawing again. Not the words, just the shape of the sun in the corner, the way the crayon had smudged into the paper. The kind of imperfection that meant it had been made with real hands, not copied, not traced, and that was what this shot had to be. Something real, something that came from her, not from expectations or equations. She squeezed the trigger and the rifle, barked again. Not loud, but final, and the round vanished into the long breath of air between her and the plate, and the camp fell still. Even the birds seemed to pause as the tracer line faded, and the waiting began again, a kind of suspended moment that made every second feel like glass on skin. The spotter gasped first, then the analyst, then the drone operator shouted over the comm that the plate had been struck again, same point of impact or within millimeters, and the general felt his stomach turn, not with doubt, but with something worse. The realization that the rules had changed, and he had no idea what game they were now playing. Ava stood slowly, brushed the dust from her elbows, and looked back toward the tent, but no one met her gaze. They were too busy talking, too busy planning, already rewriting what this meant and how they would use it and who would claim credit for it. But she knew that none of them had been behind the trigger. None of them had held the stillness in their lungs when it mattered. She walked to her quarters without a word and sat on the edge of her bunk, staring at the wall where her pack leaned against the frame inside it. The photograph still folded, the edges more worn, now the ink beginning to blur. And she thought again about what the general had asked. Would you do it again? And the answer still sat in her chest. But now it felt heavier than before, because the next shot would not be at a plate. It would not be at steel or paper. The next shot would be real and necessary and unforgiving, and she knew they would ask her to take it. And she also knew that saying yes might save lives or end them, and that neither outcome would feel like victory. Outside, the camp buzzed with energy, people moving, faster, talking louder, as if the world had already changed and they were all just trying to catch up. But Ava moved slower now, more deliberate every step, a choice. Every breath, a reminder that control was not just about the weapon, but about what came after the silence. The general called for her again, this time, not in front of the others, this time behind the closed doors of a secured tent, where files were stacked and satellite images glowed on screens, and he pointed to one of them. A convoy, Moving through a disputed corridor, a target labeled, "Not yet authorized, but likely imminent." He asked her again, "Not would you shoot, but are you ready?" And she said nothing, because ready was a word people used when they didn't understand the weight of a shot. Ready was something others decided about you, but she knew that the only real answer came in the moment when the crosshairs settled and the finger moved and the world changed. And somewhere deep inside she realized that no matter what came next, no matter how many plates she struck or how many observers she proved wrong, the truth would always live in the space between the breath and the bullet. The space where she stopped being a soldier or a woman or a name and became only the question that the shot was meant to answer. And that answer was coming soon. The sky was gray and heavy. When they brought her the new case, it was marked classified and sealed with layers of tape and code, and when she opened it, she found the rifle had been altered again, rebalanced with new optics and internal dampeners, the kind that were not yet standard issue and not even field tested. She ran her fingers along the metal and felt the difference like a whisper between words not spoken but understood. The weight had shifted slightly enough to throw off rhythm for anyone else, but not for her. Not anymore. The camp was alive with voices clipped and urgent, people she did not recognize wearing lanyards and talking in acronyms that tried to turn killing into policy. She moved past them without speaking. Her boots soft on the gravel. The range ahead of her stretched long and lonely, now closed to the rest of the unit, only her signature allowed. Past the checkpoint, the guards stepped aside and she walked into the silence like it belonged to her because it did. She lay prone once more. This time the plate was gone, replaced by a three-dimensional silhouette made of dense material with thermal nodes to simulate blood flow. It stood at the far end, just over 4,000 meters away, the farthest shot yet, and shaped like a man, not a figure. Not a shape, but a man. Someone who might have a family. Someone who might breathe and curse and fear the night, just like the rest of them. The general stood behind the glass watching again, but this time he was not. Alone, two men in suits and one woman with an expression like steel joined him, their eyes flat, their tablets glowing with briefings and expectations. They spoke in terms like threshold validation and mission modeling, and none of it meant anything to her because they were still waiting for proof from machines when the truth was already in the wind and in her hands. She adjusted the rifle slowly, letting her body find the balance again. The stock pressed against her shoulder, the cheek weld. Steady, the scope aligned. The wind was calm for now, but she knew it could turn the moment the shot left the barrel, and so she waited, not for permission, not for the countdown, just for the feeling, the one that told her the world had stopped spinning, long enough to let the bullet pass clean. The new scope fed her data in real-time overlays and wind lines and predicted trajectories, all glowing faintly on the lens. But she ignored them all, her focus on the target, on the shape that was not a man, but could be and might be soon, the crosshair resting just below the shoulder where the heart would be if it were real. She breathed once, twice, and held, and in that stillness came the memory of the last time she had pulled the trigger. Not on a range, not for training, but in the field years ago in the dark, on a roof with rain falling and a voice in her ear telling her to wait, telling her not yet, and then telling her now, and she had fired, and the target had dropped, and the mission had succeeded, and the file had been closed, but the sound of that shot had followed her ever since. She squeezed the trigger, and the rifle kicked gently against her body, the suppressor dulling the sound, but not the feeling, and the bullet vanished across the landscape. Faster than thought, faster than regret, and the camp went silent again, waiting again, praying or doubting or both. The drone feed caught the impact a fraction of a second before the data confirmed it. A direct hit center mass. The target fell backward. The sensors lit up green, and a cheer rose somewhere behind the glass, but she did not move. She stared through the scope, watching the dust settle around the fallen form, her fingers still resting against the trigger, as if waiting for a reason to fire again. The general came to her later alone, his face unreadable, his voice low. He told her that the demonstration had succeeded, that the observers were convinced that funding would come, that doctrine would change, that training programs would be rewritten around her, that she would be offered a place at the table where these decisions were made, and he paused, then said something else, that they had a live target. Now, not a simulation, not a test, a real person, a confirmed asset who would be in the open for only a short window, and that window was coming soon. She said nothing. She stood slowly, her knees stiff from the ground, her back tight from the posture. She gathered her gear without a word and walked back to the quarters where the photograph still sat folded beneath her pillow. The edges frayed. Now the ink faded. She unfolded it and stared at the face drawn in crayon. The sun in the corner still crooked, still bright, and she closed her eyes and tried to breathe. That night, the camp was quieter than usual, the buzz of victory dampened by the reality of what came next. She could feel the shift in the air, the way people looked at her now. Not with doubt, but with distance, as if she had become something other than one of them, something to be watched or studied or feared. She met with the general before dawn, the map laid out between them, satellite photos showing the convoy, the route, the terrain. He pointed to a ridge marked with elevation and wind markers and said, "This is where you'll take the shot, if we greenlight the mission." She asked what the mission was. He said, "Target is a financier, responsible for over 24 operations, high confidence, high impact, low collateral risk." He said it like a line from a script, and she listened like someone reading between the lines. He left her alone with the map, and she stared at the place where she would lie, where the rifle would rest, where the crosshair would float, and the question formed, not could she do it, but should she, and that question weighed more than the rifle, than the mission, than the expectations of every person who had watched her make the impossible routine. At the ridge 2 days later, she lay flat in the dirt, the wind stronger than predicted, the sun behind her, the convoy not yet in sight. The general's voice in her ear telling her to hold, telling her to confirm, visual telling her to wait. And she did wait, her finger resting near the trigger, her breath steady, her mind empty, except for the memory of the drawing and the promise she had made quietly to herself when no one was listening. Then the convoy appeared. 3 vehicles moving fast, dust trailing behind them. The drone confirmed the target in the second vehicle back. Left seat window open, head exposed, the perfect shot, the kind of shot legends were made of, and she adjusted the scope dialed in. The elevation compensated for drift and waited for the command, but the command did not come. Just silence, then static. Then the general's voice strained, not clear, saying, "Hold, hold, hold!" And she could hear someone else in the background arguing, and then another voice, a new one saying, "Take it now, take the shot now before we lose it." And she had to decide, in that breathless space between order and instinct, whether the trigger should move or remain still. And she breathed once slowly, then again, and in her mind she saw the plate at 4,000 meters, and the hole she had made, and she saw the shape of the man who might be a monster, or just another pawn, and she saw the face in the photograph and the sun that never set, and she touched the trigger and waited. She held the breath that measured everything and felt time compress into a narrow wire that trembled under her fingers, and in that long, shallow inhale, she made the decision that had been forming since the first impossible hole in the plate. She did not fire. She eased pressure off the trigger and let the barrel settle away from the man, shaped silhouette, and in the silence that followed, radios clicked and voices surged, and someone shouted a name and someone else swore. But none of those sounds tugged at her, like the small image folded into her palm like a talisman she had touched it again and again while the world tried to own what she had given it. The convoy passed out of sight, and the ground seemed to loosen under the boots of the men watching, and a ripple of anger moved through the command tent like wind through dead leaves, and the general stared straight at her as if he could read the moment off her skin, and not a single observer looked away because history was not a private thing anymore. It was a spectacle, and she had refused an act of demonstration, and, in doing so, she changed their calculus. They called her to the tent with voices that were equal parts cold and curious, and she walked without haste, carrying the weight of a shot not taken, and the knowledge that absence can carry consequence as sharp as a bullet, and the men in suits circled with questions that pretended not to be questions, and the woman with the steel face who had watched from the glass did not hide the fact that she felt betrayed. Ava did not defend herself. She placed the photograph on the table and smoothed the creased edge like smoothing a map with a fingertip, and the general leaned forward and kissed the paper with his eyes and asked why, and she did not speak of morality or orders. She said only that she had seen what a shot could do, and that what came after had to be something she could carry without breaking. And the room swallowed the answer, the way dry land swallows. Rain, negotiations followed, and accusations folded like knives into conversation. And the narrative they wanted to write about her changed with every person who put a stamp on the file, and she watched men bargain over her silence and her refusal, and the prize they thought she was worth. And she felt an unfamiliar dizziness, as if she were watching her life from a distance and not controlling its edges. Some praised her secretly for restraint, and others plotted quietly against her for having the temerity to decide, and the unit that had once called her one of them now kept distance as if the decision made her contagious with a doubt they did not want to inherit, and in the middle of that, she went back to the ridge to lie in the dirt and look at where the horizon blurred, and imagine the sun that the child had drawn, and for a moment she felt relief, then a hollow ache at her own uncertain courage. News began to leak because truth does not respect tense marked classified, and soon strangers with notebooks and cameras hovered at the camp perimeter whispering and editing and inventing, and the general had to answer to men in offices where decisions were cheaper and louder than they were in the valley. And he chose words that suited him, which left a bitter aftertaste in her mouth in the weeks that followed. Offers came in envelopes and threats in whispers, and a single gift in the form of a transfer request for a quieter posting that read like an exile wrapped in kindness, and she considered it and thought of the child and of the little message on the back of the photograph, and she wondered if every choice was just a different kind of exile.